Here with me today is Archbishop Cordileone, who oversees the Archdiocese of San Francisco in California. Archbishop, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So recently, you made waves in both Catholic and political circles with your document, Before I Formed You in the Womb, I Knew You. And this document examined the implications of pro-abortion, high-profile Catholics who are using their platforms to advocate for abortion policy. Can you break this down for our audience, Archbishop? Can a high-profile Catholic, in good conscience, support and advocate for abortion?
Absolutely not. And it really grieves me that this question needs to be asked. It's understandable that it's being asked, but it should be known by everyone that Catholics don't support anything that advocates for an injustice or deprivation of a basic human right, such as the right to life. That should be immediately known by everyone. But it's absolutely not possible. Catholics don't favor anything that furthers injustice or deprives people of rights. And it's not possible to be a Catholic with a properly formed conscience in good standing and favor an evil such as abortion.
One quote you had in Before I Formed You in the Womb, I Knew You that really stood out to me was you said that you, quote, tremble at the idea that you would not challenge a pro-abortion Catholic. And you said that if you didn't challenge pro-abortion Catholics from your position, that you feel that you would have to answer to God for innocent blood, and that this politician would also have to answer to God for innocent blood. And when I read that, I thought of high-profile Catholics like President Biden and Nancy Pelosi, who are using their platforms to advocate for abortion. If Biden or Pelosi showed up at a mass that you were saying and came to your communion line, would you be comfortable giving them Holy Communion?
That's a good and very pertinent question. I also speak in my document about the need for conversations to take place between pastors, the bishop or the parish pastor, and the individual, so they understand the error of their ways, they understand what the teaching of the church is. So that avoids such a situation. I have had such conversations with Speaker Pelosi. She knows that I stand by church teaching, and I know she is respectful enough not to do anything so provocative. So I'm confident that would not happen. In the case of President Biden or any other prominent Catholic, I think what I would do is, if I knew that they were coming into the area here and plan to attend Mass, I would try to have those conversations as well ahead of time.
Now, we're not seeing a lot of cohesion in the Catholic Church among bishops. For example, San Diego Bishop Robert McElroy said this week that he was horrified at statements saying that President Biden shouldn't be given Holy Communion. And he spoke out against statements like yours and said that Biden should be given communion because we don't know what's on his heart. What would you say to Bishop McElroy and other clergy who say we don't know what's on Biden's heart, so we should be giving him communion until we do?
There's the problem of scandal. Unless there's some kind of a public backtrack or retraction, better yet, they're still advocating for something that is evil. And so this was why, I cite that passage from the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of pastors. If we don't say anything, if we don't speak out, then we're also culpable. And I tremble with this responsibility God has given me. So in my letter, I try to lay out clearly the church teaching, so there can be no disagreement about church teaching. Here I try to make it as clear and concise as possible. When it comes to the pastoral application of church teaching, and that's where their pastoral discretion is needed. Different judgments might be made by different bishops in different situations. But in the case of someone so prominent as the President of the United States, again, this is a scandal, and it's causing confusion in the minds of our Catholics. Again, I go back to the question you asked. It's understandable you asked that question. That's alarming to me, that anyone would doubt that a Catholic could favor something so evil as abortion. And we also, in our Catholic faith, need to teach our people better about what it means to receive communion, because it's different from the way Protestants view it. For Catholics, it means that act of communion, receiving the sacrament of communion, it expresses the communion one already has with the church. That is, that they accept church teaching and are trying to live their life according to that church teaching. If they reject any of those teachings or are living their lives not in conformity in a serious way, such as advocating for a very serious evil, then they're not properly disposed to receive communion. So this is what is causing confusion in the minds of our people. They see them receiving communion, so they think, oh, it must be okay for a Catholic to favor abortion, and it's not. So there's this very serious problem of scandal and of confusion that's being caused in the minds of our people. And the church's pastors have a responsibility to teach, not just using words and making statements, but being very forthright in guiding our people and helping them to form their consciences properly.
Well, Archbishop, once upon a time, I feel like this would never have been a question, whether a Catholic in good standing should be advocating for abortion. How did we reach this point?
The secular culture is very strong, and that this movement has been just kind of affected all segments of society. No one is left untouched by this. And I think part of the problem that, well, Catholics, a lot of Catholics and other people, like I said, everywhere in society have succumbed to this kind of cultural mentality. But the abortion advocates have been masterful at claiming the narrative, first of all, by deflecting attention away from what it really is. And we just refer to it, but we don't really think about what happens in an abortion. That's why I debated whether or not to have that passage in there that describes it, but I thought, no, we have to lay out the reality so people can understand how greatly evil it is. And the other thing is how this strategy of changing the language. If you change the language and you get people to adopt the language, then you won the argument. So that's why I bristle when I hear the abortion rights advocates referred to as pro-choice, because really we're all pro-choice. We all believe that people have the right to make choices to affect their own lives. And we all believe that those rights have to be limited when they deprive other people of their rights. So just ask gun control advocates about that. That's their approach to this situation. Many of us who are affirm the human dignity of life in the womb are pro-choice when it comes to school vouchers, for example. And many who favor abortion are not pro-choice when it comes to school vouchers. So they've co-opted the language, and we have to be very careful not to fall into that trap. It troubles me that so many people who understand the dignity of human life in the womb use that phrase. Our side, who are pro-life, are described as anti-abortion. I don't mind being called anti-abortion, because I don't mean being called anti-anything that is a grave injustice. But if it's pro and anti on the left side of the hyphen, the word on the right side of the hyphen has to be the same word. Otherwise, we're talking about two different issues. So I think this idea of changing the language and getting people to adopt that, and then deflecting attention away from the grave evil that abortion is, has duped many people, and it's made too many inroads into all segments of our society.
That's really interesting. And going along that point, another momentous cultural phenomenon we're seeing recently is there are many on the left and even some in the middle of the road who are advocating for transgender surgeries and procedures for minors, not just adults, for minors. And this is something that I haven't really seen the Catholic Church address very much yet. What is your take on all of this? What is going on in society that we're preparing to allow children to be operated on to remove their genitalia to become another gender?
Yes, this is a discussion that is emerging among the bishops, and we are in the works of trying to grapple with this and give some guidance to our people. It's a good question. I think it's the next step when getting further away from the original created order of male and female. He created them. God created the human race, male and female, with this sexual complementarity. And the more we deny that and get away from it, the further and further away it goes. It's very alarming, especially when the science is all against that. There's so much scientific evidence of the harm this does to children, giving them puberty blockers, and not just in terms of their sexual development, but otherwise too, psychologically and other aspects of physical health. It's terrible. But the the narrative, the other side has captured the narrative, and many people have been duped into thinking this way. It perplexes me. I don't know how anyone could think that something that's so obvious as a boy is a boy and he needs to grow into being a man, that can be a question, that maybe that's not the case. I don't understand it.
Well, it's one of many questions that we've grappled with as of late. And I think in the past year, the Catholic Church, perhaps in particular, has struggled with different questions throughout the pandemic. I know you yourself were involved in some litigation focused on religious freedom throughout the pandemic. Can you speak to that at all? Did the Catholic Church suffer throughout the pandemic? How did bishops and priests react to government directives to close churches and no longer give the sacraments to the people?
Yes, early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of fear and panic and uncertainty. We didn't know much about this virus. So bishops everywhere moved to temporarily closing the churches and live streaming our masses until we could get a better sense of what this virus is about and get some kind of control over it. When things a couple of months later started kind of gradually opening up, they kept religion shut down. So this was the big alarm for me. And I had been insisting all along that the government doesn't have the authority to tell the church not to worship. So I'm grateful to governors who have declared religious worship essential, but it also troubles me because just as they don't have the right to say we're not essential, they don't have the right to say we are essential. Only the religious authority can say what religious services are essential or not. But we willingly went along with this to cooperate with the government in trying to, as they said, flatten the curves. Our hospitals will not be overwhelmed and we could manage it. But when things started to then open up more and they were allowing businesses, the stores to go back into operation, but not churches, it became very clear that they were discriminating against us. And once again, they were not following science. Especially by the summer, we had done a study, some infectious disease experts did studies of Catholic masses that were conducted following a set of safety protocols that had been developed by a specialized committee with people from different backgrounds of theology and liturgy and health science and so forth to figure out a way to celebrate the Mass safely. And these experts studied 1 million Catholic Masses that were celebrated over a 14-week period using these safety protocols. And there was not one outbreak of COVID at those Masses. So we had the evidence to show we can do it safely. And it was especially severe here in San Francisco, where in May of last year, so about a year ago at this time, the city had asked the faith communities to submit a safety plan, anticipating that we would be going back to indoor worship, which we and many others did. The stores also submitted a safety plan, and the city approved the state safety plan of the store so they can go into operation with some limited capacity and so forth, reasonable measures. But they just ignored religious services. And then the street protests started happening after the George Floyd incident. And they allowed the protests to go on. City officials even participated in them. But the rule for other outdoor gatherings, religious gatherings, was only 12 people and only outdoors. So this was clearly discrimination against us. So that's when we began mounting a movement we called Free the Mass to call attention to the discrimination we were suffering.
There's so many different things like that have happened this year. I think you referenced the riots and the destruction and then infringements on religious liberty. And now we're talking about pro-abortion Catholics causing scandal in the church. I know a lot of Catholics that say they're very discouraged and they're afraid by these times. What advice would you give to Catholics who are afraid or discouraged right now?
Well, to trust in God. We don't know why God is allowing these things to happen in our time, but if he is, it's because he's calling us to spiritual greatness. Spiritual greatness doesn't capitulate to discouragement or a sense of defeat. It means being loyal to our Lord Jesus Christ, especially in the hard times. That's what makes for saints. It's a special moment when God's calling us to excel in our spiritual life and to pursue this path of holiness despite all of the distress, despite all of the opposition we are facing, and despite the way we're being treated. We need to be faithful to who God calls us to be, to continue to be a light. I do believe there is this encroaching darkness that's beginning to envelop us. Who's going to be the light? We need points of light. That has to be our people of faith who remain true to their faith.
Are you ever afraid?
I can't say that I'm afraid for myself. I do have some anxiety over what's going to be happening in our society in the coming years. Because of this disintegration, the society just seems to be disintegrating, and it's began with the disintegration of the family, right? The mother and father and children united in the bonds of familial love. When that disintegrates, then we see this disintegration happening everywhere else. And now there doesn't seem to be a common sense of decency and respect for the other, which in a society that's imbued with a Christian ethos, even those who are not of the Christian faith, there's this kind of cultural mentality that that we should be respectful to others. Now, I know some are going to cite there is a severe problem with racism in the history of our country. They'll cite all kinds of atrocities. But what I would respond is that that is true. And people like me and many others who are patriotic and love this country have to admit there's been a really bad record of racism. But because it's a country that used to be imbued with the Christian ethos, we finally got it right, right? Men went to war to free the slaves. We had a civil rights movement that was led by leaders of faith who laid their lives on the line, Martin Luther King being the great martyr of that era, but other people that were laying their lives on the line for civil rights. So it's true because of our it's not because of Christian faith, it's because of human weakness and blindness that those things happen. But because we had a Christian ethos, we were finally able to get it right and correct that. So I see this now, a collapse of the Christian ethos, and there's no sense of civility or trying to understand the other, come to kind of a mutual understanding. This is what I experienced in the Free the Mass movement. There was no really sense of trying to listen to the other and come to a common understanding. They just kept us locked down. So that's what worries me. I'm like I said, I'm not afraid for myself personally, but I do worry about the future of our society.
Well, Archbishop, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. We appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me again.